right, it is July. It is tropical season. Let's put them together. Let's go by the numbers and look at July hurricanes. Not tropical depressions, tropical storms, just historically hurricanes. I was curious, how many have we had? What is the frequency of them? Are they typically strong? Where is the highest probability of seeing a hurricane in July? Again, July's skewing towards, again, closer to the beginning of the tropical season rather than, the midway point. So we still have a long ways to go. So let's start with this, a look at the typical July development regions. And again, you don't see an overwhelming favorable zone. A couple reasons for that. We usually don't get to the best conditions, best sea surface temperatures, best overall pattern for hurricane development. Not to say it can't happen, it obviously can. But you see some areas that are possible, but nothing that's favorable, more favorable, or extremely favorable for development. So that takes me to kind of like my next question that I had is, well, how many have we had July hurricanes that have made a U.S. landfall? Not July hurricanes that stay out to sea, but that have actually made landfall. It's kind of interesting. So since 1850, going up to now, really through 2024, but it's 2025, of the 307 hurricanes that have made landfall over the United States, 31 have been in July, and that accounts for just under 10% of all of our landfalling hurricanes. So July, historically, accounts for about 10% of all the hurricane landfalls that we've had. Obviously, Texas and Florida jump out as the highest occurrences. Makes sense. Florida jets out into the Gulf towards the Caribbean. They catch a lot of tropical systems, so 7 hurricanes there going back to 1850. Texas, the big one, 10. And then North Carolina and Louisiana are next, 4 apiece. 3 for South Carolina, just 1 for Mississippi, and 2 for Alabama. None for Georgia, but fairly evenly distributed outside of Texas as well as Florida. But if you look at it from a standpoint of how much coastline there is there, that kind of makes sense. Alabama has the smallest coastline, right after is Mississippi, and so makes sense why the landfalls there are lesser so. So let's take a look at those most recent July landfalls. So I just looked at the last 20 years. This goes back to 2005. And you can see I started the track with Beryl way out here. And again, that was Category 5, but I'm more focused on what strength it was when it made landfall. So we'll pan this over. You see Dennis in 05, Dolly in 08, Cindy as well in 05. And then you got Hannah in 2020. Arthur in 2014, that was one I remember pretty vividly because that one kind of pulsed up pretty good and then clipped the Outer Banks. And that was an early season one. That was right around July 4th weekend. So that was, one of those systems that can be impactful early in the season. Barry was kind of a junk system. Hannah, all of these ended up being Category 1s, the majority of them Category 1s. Even Beryl, that at one point was a very strong Category 5, made landfall as a Category 1 near Matagorda, Texas. You had a couple other landfalling storms. Hannah was also a Category 1. And then you look at Barry along the Louisiana coastline, was literally a hurricane for about 5 minutes, but it counts. All of these, again, taking place in July. And then the one that jumps out is Dennis. Hurricane Dennis was actually a Category 4 for a good part of its trip through the Gulf of Mexico, even the Caribbean, and it made landfall between Mobile and Destin as a Category 3. That was back in 2005. That one, if you live in that part of the country, obviously, you know how impactful that was. And really, it made landfall in Florida, but it had a pretty big impact on Alabama. And then, of course, you got Arthur up there that was a Category 2 storm. But you notice a lot of Category 1s. And that's the case going all the way back to 1850. There are some stronger storms. Let's look at the top 5 based off of wind speed. So something else to note, before 1950, we did not name hurricanes, tropical systems. They were just the storm of whatever year, whatever landfall, and sometimes they'd put like a letter with it. So we start with the strongest July hurricane. It's Hurricane Dennis. Obviously 2005, we just talked about that. 105 mile an hour winds at landfall. And its central pressure was impressive as well. Right up there with the unnamed 1916. So that back in 1916 in Mississippi, that was a pretty significant system, and it actually had a big impact on Alabama coastline as well, as we'll talk about. In 1909, there was another very strong Category 3 hurricane that made landfall, 100-mile-an-hour sustained winds. Also in 1916, crazy, that was a busy year, 1916. In South Carolina, 95-mile-an-hour sustained winds. It was a Category 2, and then you had Bertha in 96. And there were several others that were very close within Bertha's strength, 90-mile-an-hour winds, also a Category 2, and that was in North Carolina. So as you see here on this map, we can have stronger hurricanes in July. They're just not as frequent as late in the season. We tend to see your stronger hurricanes, higher intensity as we get into August, September, even October from a historic standpoint. So let's focus now on Alabama. So I grabbed 3 different tracks. So one of these, which was the 1916 hurricane, didn't actually make a landfall in Alabama. However, it clipped Fort Morgan and Dauphin Island, and it registered wind speeds there about 121 miles an hour. So it was very close to making a landfall, and that's why I included it. It's such a small area to hit the Alabama coastline, and this was very close, making landfall near Pascagoula on July 5th of 1916. And then you look at unnamed 1870. We all remember that one, right? July 30th, that came straight up as a Category 1. This was a big flooding issue for Mobile Bay. You think about it, the bay is fairly shallow. You have this, even a Category 1, have you ever used a squeegee before to get rid of water in a garage? You push the water and it all has to go forward somewhere. And the Gulf works very similar. As these storms move towards the coastline, there's an upwelling of water, and then that caused some serious flooding in and around Mobile. And then Hurricane Danny is the most recent one. That was back in 1997, and this one actually made 2 landfalls, one clipping the Louisiana coastline, but then its second, Mullet Point, Alabama, which is a little south of Mobile, a little bit to the north of Gulf Shores and Orange Beach. It, again, was a Category 1, and let's take a look at some more data associated with these. So it was the Danny was a Category 1, winds of 70 miles an hour, central pressure 984. You look at the 1870, and understand back in the 1800s, there's a lot of uncertainty with pressure and the measurements of these. It just didn't have the same info as we did. But for all intent and purposes, it was a Category 1 storm. And again, you don't have to have a high end to be impactful, as we know. And that one was near Mobile Bay. And then the 1916, of course, that was a Mississippi landfall, but estimated winds of 105. I mentioned when it went through Fort Morgan, Dauphin Island, even Pensacola, all those places registered winds in the 100 to 120 mile an hour range, and estimated central pressure of 950. Notice the difference. Pressure's lower, typically a stronger hurricane. So a little history there on Alabama. Again, 2 landfalling Alabama July hurricanes all time. So the tropical storms, but as for hurricanes, so what's next, right? We're still in hurricane season, obviously. In fact, we're a long ways away from being done. We look at August, and remember that July map I showed you? There was a couple areas shaded in that yellow for possible. Look at how open it becomes from a historical perspective with development regions. You now have a more favorable, huge zone right off basically the Gulf Stream as you head towards the Outer Banks and then out towards the Western Atlantic. You also have this really, really extended, wide area that goes from basically the Windward Islands, Lesser Antilles, back to the Central Atlantic, and right up towards the Bahamas, Bermuda, and then a little bullseye there in the Gulf as well. Again, this is based off of historic tracks, so we just start to see activity increasing. As for our climatology for the year, let's plot where we are with respect to where we should be. You ever go to the mall and you're trying to figure out where the heck you are, try to get to a department store? So this is kind of that for hurricane season. Here is where we are at. We're towards the end of July. There's a big, steep climb to the peak, which is typically in September 10th, 15th, somewhere in there. And so that kind of explains why the development regions start to really increase as we head into August. So we'll keep a close eye on this. Tropics are fairly quiet here, mid to late July. Hope it stays that way, and hopefully we learn something. I always do when I look into these numbers. I find it interesting, gives good perspective, and there you have it. Hurricane landfalls in July. Less than 10% of all 307 U.S. hurricane landfalls back to 1850. The more you know.